What if everything you thought you knew about World War II had been carefully shaped to hide some of the most disturbing military operations ever carried out on foreign soil? What if the fighters who used methods so harsh and so mentally overwhelming that their own government locked the records away for 80 years were not enemies from afar but Americans? On the morning of December 8, 1941, 23 hours after Pearl Harbor fell into flames, a telegram reached the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. The document was standard War Department material, but the message inside was anything but ordinary. It asked for the immediate presence of tribal council members at Fort Wuka for what it described as a matter of national security and cultural preservation. By nightfall, 12 Apache elders had traveled across the Sonoran Desert to the military post. What unfolded in that meeting would never appear in any official wartime record. The meeting room had no windows and was lit by a single bulb that cast long shadows over the concrete walls. Sitting across from the elders were 3 soldiers in army uniforms with no name tags and with their rank markings removed. The oldest of these officers, a man the Apache would later identify only as the colonel, placed a leather folder on the table but left it closed. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a faint tremble that hinted at exhaustion or perhaps something far heavier. "We are about to ask you to help us win a war using methods that will never be recognized by this government or any other. What we discuss here tonight will be classified at levels beyond even our nuclear program. If you accept what we ask, you will be training men to become something the world has not witnessed since your ancestors lived and fought in these mountains. You will be shaping ghosts." The tribal chairman, a man named Joseph Tissos, studied the officer's expression for a long moment before speaking. His answer, preserved in a single declassified fragment that surfaced in 2014, was chilling in its simplicity. "Our grandfathers understood how to make an enemy fear the darkness. If you want us to teach your soldiers that skill, you must know it carries a cost. Once a man learns to move like the wind and strike like the mountain lion, he does not easily return to being someone who sleeps without fear." What the military planned went far beyond the well-known Navajo code talkers who would later be honored. This was something entirely different. This was about turning ancient Apache guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare techniques passed down through oral tradition into a modern weapon when combined with contemporary military instruction. These forces would operate in the deepest shadows of both the Pacific and European battlefields. The program never received an official title in any document that has come to light. Researchers who have spent decades rebuilding its history from scattered pieces simply call it the Shadow War Initiative, the first version of what would later be known as the Shadow Warrior program. By January of 1942, the first volunteers reached a newly built training site 30 miles northeast of Fort Wuka in a box canyon that had once been Apache hunting land. The site was chosen with purpose. The military wanted the trainees to sense the presence of their ancestors and awaken something primal that ordinary boot camps could not teach. 147 men reported for instruction. Only 63 completed it. The others vanished from military files entirely. Their families were sent telegrams stating they had been moved to classified duties. No additional details were ever given. The training conducted in that canyon over the next 6 months has been described through scattered testimonies and partially blacked-out documents as being far beyond anything the military had tried before or since. The men learned to move across terrain without disturbing a single leaf, to navigate by stars and by scent, and to survive for weeks behind enemy lines with nothing but their own skill. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they learned how to inflict psychological terror in ways that crushed an enemy's spirit long before a fight ever began. A journal entry written by Lieutenant Robert Chen, one of only 3 non-Apache officers permitted to observe the training, was found among his belongings after he died in 1998. The entry dated March 14, 1942 reads, "Today I witnessed something that made me wonder whether we are truly the good guys in this war." The instructors demonstrated something they called the fear walk. It requires approaching an enemy position for hours, leaving subtle signs that you are present, yet never revealing who or what you are. You shift small objects. You leave markings that hint that something not quite human has moved through. You create sounds that the human mind cannot clearly recognize. By the time you finally strike, the enemy is already mentally broken. They believe they are fighting ghosts, and ghosts cannot be killed. I asked Sergeant Chino if he worried about what becomes of our men when they return home after learning these methods. He looked at me with eyes far older than his 24 years and said, "They will not all return, and those who do will not come back as the same men." I am starting to grasp what he meant. The first deployment of these Apache units took place in June of 1942. 12 men were sent into the Philippines, where they were ordered to operate behind Japanese lines in the thick jungles of Mindanao. Their publicly stated mission was intelligence gathering. The truth was entirely different. They were carrying out what modern analysts would describe as extremely aggressive psychological operations paired with targeted assassinations designed to create overwhelming fear with minimal direct conflict. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji, a Japanese officer whose diary was recovered after the war and translated by American intelligence, described encounters with what he believed were supernatural forces. His entry from August 3, 1942 recounts an event that left 20 of his soldiers dead without a single shot being fired. We found Sergeant Nakamura hanging from a tree at dawn. His throat had been cut, yet there was no blood on the ground beneath him. Around the tree were markings we could not identify, symbols that appeared to shift whenever you tried to look at them directly. That night we heard noises in the jungle unlike anything I have ever known. Not animal, not human, something entirely different. By morning, 6 more soldiers were dead. Each had been killed while they slept, their eyes open wide as if they had witnessed something that froze their hearts. We found no tracks, no signs of movement, nothing to show that any person had entered our camp. My commanding officer has ordered us to leave this position. The men are terrified. They speak of spirits and demons. I do not know what is hunting us, but it is winning. What Yamamoto could not have known, and what remained hidden until partially released documents in 2006, was that only 2 Apache operatives had caused the deaths of those Japanese soldiers and the mental collapse of an entire battalion. The methods they used were never formally recorded, but bits of information suggest they combined ancient Apache stealth practices with newly created chemical substances that produced hallucinations when absorbed through the skin, along with acoustic devices that released subsonic frequencies known to trigger severe anxiety and paranoia. Back at the training grounds in Arizona, a second group of recruits was going through even harsher preparation. The military had realized after the first mission that Apache tactics were incredibly powerful, but they wanted to broaden and intensify the program. By late 1942, the facility had expanded to accommodate more than 300 trainees and instructors. It had also gained a disturbing reputation among the regular soldiers stationed at Fort Wuka. Troops reported seeing lights flickering in the canyon at strange hours, hearing noises that had no logical origin, and meeting men from the facility who moved and spoke in ways that did not feel human. A report submitted by Captain James Morrison, the base psychiatrist, in November 1942 raised concerns that were immediately classified and hidden. The report stated, "I have now evaluated 17 men who interacted with personnel from the Canyon program. All described similar symptoms: persistent nightmares, a constant feeling of being observed, and an inability to feel secure even inside rooms with locked doors and guards standing nearby. 3 men have asked for transfer to frontline combat units, explaining they would rather face the enemy than remain on a base with what one corporal called men who have stopped being men. I attempted to visit the facility to assess the mental state of the trainees, but my request was denied by order of command. I cannot identify who issued the refusal. I am seriously worried about what is being shaped in that canyon and what may happen when these individuals are sent into battle where no oversight or accountability exists." The concerns proved justified. Between 1942 and 1945, Apache Shadow units were sent to every major combat zone of the war. They operated in Italy, France, Germany, throughout the Pacific Islands, and in China. Their missions were never coordinated with standard military leadership. They received orders through a separate chain of command that reported directly to a classified office inside the War Department that officially did not exist. When regular units encountered the results of their operations, they were given cover explanations involving special forces, local resistance groups, or unexplained enemy losses. In the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge, a German battalion reported being slowly destroyed by what they called ghost soldiers. A letter from Oberleutnant Hans Richter to his wife, intercepted by Allied intelligence, described his unit's final days. "Marta, I do not believe I will return to you. We are being hunted by something that cannot be explained. Every night more men vanish. We find them days later, if we find them at all, always in places that should have been impossible to reach without anyone hearing or seeing movement. The Americans have released something ancient, something that remembers when warfare meant shattering the spirit before harming the body. Our officers tell us to hold the line, but there is no line, there is only the forest and the things that move through it. Last night I saw one of them, only a glimpse in the moonlight. He was covered in markings and his eyes reflected the light like the eyes of a wild creature. He looked at me and I felt my courage slip away. I now understand why our men are running. It is not cowardice. It is the instinct to live. Some forces are not meant to be faced. The German unit surrendered 3 days later, marking the first time in the war that an entire Wehrmacht battalion had surrendered without engaging in a single direct fight. When questioned by American intelligence, the German soldiers all reported similar experiences of supernatural encounters, psychological torment, and an enemy that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. The intelligence files were immediately classified and removed from normal wartime documentation. In the Pacific, the operations became even more extreme. On Okinawa, Japanese defenders began reporting attacks by what they called the Silent Ones. These were enemies who never spoke, never fully revealed themselves, and seemed capable of entering the most secure positions without setting off alarms or meeting resistance. A document from the Japanese High Command, discovered after the war in the ruins of a bunker, described an incident in which an entire command center was found with all personnel dead, their bodies showing no marks of struggle or external injury. Medical evaluation suggested they had died from what modern investigators would describe as severe stress-induced heart failure. All on the same night, all at nearly the same moment. An American Marine Corps after-action report from May 1945, partially released in 2009, described coming upon the results of what was clearly an Apache Shadow unit operation. The report stated, "We moved into the cave network expecting heavy resistance because intelligence had labeled it a major Japanese supply depot and command hub. Instead, we discovered close to 80 enemy fighters, all dead. The scene was unlike anything I have witnessed in 3 years of war. The bodies had been arranged in patterns that seemed carefully designed to cause overwhelming psychological shock. Some were set up to look as if they were still alive and staring toward the entrance. Others had been placed in positions that should have been physically impossible. The entire complex carried a smell I could not identify, something that filled all of us with deep unease. My men refused to stay inside the caves. Several became physically sick. We marked the area and retreated. I recommend that this site be sealed and avoided. Whatever occurred here went beyond anything found in normal warfare." By the spring of 1945, as the fighting in Europe ended and the Pacific campaign grew more intense, the Apache Shadow units had built a combat record that was both extraordinary and profoundly unsettling. They had completed more than 200 known operations, though many believed the true number was far higher. Their confirmed kill count surpassed 3,000 enemy fighters. But more importantly, they had broken the morale of numerous enemy units, triggered mass desertions, and created a psychological weapon that may have shortened the war by several months. But there was a cost the military had not expected and was not prepared to manage. The men who had been shaped into these shadow warriors were not easily returning to ordinary military life or civilian life. Reports began coming back from the Pacific during the final months of the war describing moments when members of Apache units stopped responding to commands, attacked friendly troops who startled them, or simply walked into the jungle and never came back. A classified medical report from a field hospital in the Philippines, dated July 19, 1945, described treating 3 soldiers from an Apache Shadow unit who were found wandering in a condition the doctors labeled combat psychosis, unlike anything previously observed. The report stated, "These men do not react to normal psychiatric treatment. They speak in languages that do not match any recognized Apache dialect. They show physical abilities that appear greater than standard human limits. When they are sedated, they display rapid eye movement sleep patterns connected with severe trauma, but when awake, they show no clear signs of emotional distress. It is as though they exist between full awareness and some other state of being. I have recommended they be moved to specialized care, but my requests have been denied. I was told by a colonel whose name I was instructed not to record that these men must be kept isolated, and that their condition must not be written into their official medical files." As the war ended and the massive demobilization process began, the military faced a serious problem. They had created highly trained killers who had been conditioned to operate beyond all accepted rules of warfare, who had been psychologically reshaped to embrace techniques that broke every standard of civilized conflict, and who now needed to be returned to peaceful society. The solution they chose was as cold as it was practical. They simply erased most of the Apache Shadow Warriors from official records. Of the 237 men who completed Shadow Warrior training between 1942 and 1945, only 68 appear in any post-war documentation. The others vanish completely from all records after their last assignment. Their families were told they died in combat, but no remains were ever returned. No graves were ever created. No names were listed on memorials. They became ghosts in death as they had been in war. The small number who did officially return were sent to a facility that appears in no formal documentation, but is indirectly referenced in several declassified memos from the late 1940s. Located somewhere in the mountains of New Mexico, this facility was described as a rehabilitation center for special operations personnel. Letters that survived from men who were placed there reveal a very different reality. One letter from a soldier named Thomas Naitch to his brother, dated October 6, 1946, was discovered decades later among family belongings. It reads, "They tell us they are helping us, but this place is a prison. They keep us separated from one another. They give us medications that make it difficult to think clearly. They ask us questions about what we did during the war, but when we answer truthfully, they become frightened. I believe they are trying to make us forget. But you cannot forget what you have become. The training changed something deep within us. We learned to reach into parts of our heritage that were meant to remain hidden. We learned to become what our ancestors warned us never to become, and now they are trying to erase what they created. I do not believe many of us will ever leave this place. If you receive word that I have died, do not accept it as truth. We do not die easily. Not anymore." Thomas Naitch's official death certificate dated November 3, 1946 claims he died of pneumonia at a veterans hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico. No hospital records confirm that he was ever present at any medical facility in Albuquerque. His body was never returned to his family. He was 26 years old. The disappearances did not stop with the end of the war. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a troubling pattern appeared across the southwestern United States. Apache men, many far too young to have served in World War II, began vanishing from reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Tribal police reports written during this period describe the same scenario over and over. The men would receive visits from individuals who claimed to be military recruiters or representatives from the government. They would be promised special opportunities, classified assignments, and chances to serve their country in ways that would honor their heritage. Then they would disappear. A report filed by Officer Daniel B. of the San Carlos Apache Tribal Police in April 1952 describes one such incident. "On the morning of April 9th, I was called to the home of Margaret Gone, who reported that her son, Michael, aged 23, had left 3 days earlier with 2 men in a black sedan carrying government plates. She said the men told Michael he had been chosen for a special program based on his family background. They mentioned his grandfather by name, Joseph Gozen, who served in World War II in a classified role. Margaret has not heard from Michael since. When I tried to contact the military liaison office at Fort Wuka, I was told no such recruitment had happened and that I should not pursue the matter further. I was also warned in terms that felt threatening that continuing to investigate would harm both my career and the safety of the reservation. What the tribal police did not realize, and what would not be understood for many decades, was that the Shadow Warrior program had never actually ended. It had simply moved deeper underground. The beginning of the Cold War created new demand for the type of operatives produced by the Apache program. The military and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency understood that in a world defined by nuclear standoffs and proxy conflicts, the ability to carry out missions that left no trace and delivered maximum psychological impact was more valuable than ever. A group of documents accidentally declassified in 2017 revealed that between 1948 and 1963, a follow-up program operating under the code name Night Wind recruited and trained more than 100 additional Apache operatives. These men were sent to Korea, Vietnam, Guatemala, Iran, and many other places where the United States carried out covert missions. Unlike the operatives of World War II, these men never officially existed. They had no military files, no service numbers, and no recorded identities of any kind. In Korea, rumors spread among American troops and enemy forces of something moving through the mountains that felt more like a spirit than a soldier. A Marine Corps intelligence report from December of 1950, discovered recently in misfiled documents at Camp Pendleton, describes the questioning of a captured Chinese officer who was found wandering alone after being separated from his unit. The officer, speaking through a translator, described an encounter with what he called the wind that kills. According to the report, the prisoner became highly distressed when asked about the disappearance of his unit. He insisted that they had been attacked by forces that could not be seen, that left no signs of their presence except the dead. He claimed these forces used weapons that made no sound, that killed without leaving wounds, and that appeared and vanished at will. He repeatedly said he had seen one of these attackers, describing a figure with glowing markings on his face and eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. The prisoner refused to give any more information and fell into a catatonic state. He died 3 days later from what medical personnel identified as acute heart failure brought on by severe psychological trauma. No physical explanation for his death was found. In Vietnam, the pattern continued and became even more intense. Between 1964 and 1973, reports emerged from various channels describing American Special Forces personnel who seemed to operate outside all recognized chains of command, who used methods that shocked even experienced soldiers, and who appeared to use techniques that blended modern technology with something far more ancient and instinctive. A memoir published in 1998 by former Green Beret officer Captain Raymond Teller recounts an encounter in the Central Highlands in 1967 that he had kept secret for 30 years. We were on a reconnaissance patrol when we found what looked like the aftermath of a battle. An entire Viet Cong company of about 120 men lay dead in a clearing, yet there had been no battle. There were no spent casings, no blast craters, and no signs of any fight at all. The bodies showed different causes of death, but what shocked me most were their faces. Every one of them looked utterly terrified. Their eyes were open wide, their expressions frozen in fear. Some had died while trying to run, others had taken their own lives. We found 3 who had shot themselves in the head, choosing that instead of facing whatever they had encountered. As we examined the area, one of my sergeants called me to the tree line. Carved into a large mahogany tree were symbols I did not recognize. They appeared to be some type of warning or boundary marker. My Montagnard guide took one look and refused to go any farther. He said those signs belonged to the shadow hunters and that we needed to leave at once. As we withdrew from the area, I saw movement high in the jungle canopy. Just for an instant, I saw a figure painted in patterns that seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. He was watching us to make sure we left. I never filed an official report about what we witnessed that day. I knew it would be classified or dismissed, but I have thought about it every day since. The technology used by these operatives had advanced greatly since World War II. Declassified research from the Army's Chemical and Biological Warfare Division shows that throughout the 1950s and 60s, extensive studies were conducted on compounds capable of inducing extreme fear, paranoia, and psychological breakdown. One research overview from 1961, stamped with the highest classification levels, describes experiments involving a substance referred to only as whisper agent. According to the document, whisper agent shows remarkable ability to trigger acute anxiety and auditory hallucinations in test subjects. When delivered in very small doses through skin absorption or inhalation, subjects report hearing voices, seeing distorted images, and developing overwhelming paranoia regarding their surroundings. These effects can last for 72 hours or more. When combined with environmental stress and isolation, whisper agent can cause total psychological collapse in individuals who were previously stable. It is recommended for missions involving specialized psychological operations, where maintaining plausible deniability regarding chemical use is essential. The research did not stop with chemical agents. Another document from 1964 outlines acoustic weapons designed to produce subsonic and ultrasonic frequencies that can cause disorientation, nausea, and in some cases heart failure in targeted groups. These devices were small enough to be carried by individual operatives and could be used without leaving clear evidence. A field report from Vietnam in 1968 describes the use of what was designated as Nightbird technology by unidentified special operations personnel. The report states, following the deployment, enemy forces in the area showed signs of mass hysteria. Radio intercepts indicated they believed they were under attack by supernatural beings. Many enemy fighters were seen fleeing into the jungle without their weapons. Several were found days later in states of extreme psychological distress, reporting experiences that matched the symptoms linked to Nightbird exposure. The operation reached its goals without a single shot being fired, but the most unsettling information about the program came not from official paperwork, but from the men who had been recruited and somehow lived long enough to share what happened. In 2004, a former operative using the name David Nighthorse contacted a journalist with a story he said he could no longer keep to himself. The published article appeared in a small independent outlet and was quickly removed from the internet. Only a few surviving copies remain. In the article, Nighthorse explained that he had been recruited in 1970 at age 19 from the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. "They told me I had been selected because of my bloodline," he said. "They claimed my great-grandfather had been one of the original warriors, and that something in my ancestry made me suitable for the program. They took me to a facility I cannot find on any map. It was underground, carved into a mountain somewhere in the Four Corners region. The training was beyond anything you can imagine. They did not simply train us to fight or to survive. They taught us how to reach into something they called ancestral memory. They used drugs, sensory deprivation, extreme stress, and techniques I still do not fully understand to dismantle our normal sense of self and rebuild it into something different. They taught us to move through the world as if we were not entirely part of it, to be watchers and participants at the same time, to see patterns others cannot see, to influence people through presence alone. By the time the training ended, I was not the same person who had entered that place. None of us were." Nighthorse described being sent on multiple missions between 1971 and 1976 to places he was not allowed to identify. "We would be dropped into hostile regions with objectives that were never fully explained. Sometimes we were ordered to eliminate specific individuals. Other times we were instructed simply to create confusion and fear. We used every technique they had taught us, both the ancestral Apache methods and the modern technology they developed. We were incredibly effective, but the cost was enormous. Each mission took something from us, made us less human, and made us more like the ghosts we pretended to be. Several teammates walked away into the wilderness and were never seen again. Others suffered mental breaks and ended up committed to institutions. Those who survived often could not return to normal life. We had been changed in a way that could not be undone." The journalist who published Nighthorse's story, Michael Torres, tried to verify the claims and quickly encountered barriers at every turn. When he filed Freedom of Information Act requests for documents connected to the program, he was told no such program existed. When he tried to speak to other possible operatives, he discovered most were dead, often under questionable circumstances. When he attempted to locate the facilities Nighthorse described, he found military sites with officially unrelated missions, and entry was completely forbidden. Torres released 2 additional articles before suddenly ending his investigation in 2006. In his final piece, he wrote, "I have been warned by sources I trust that continuing this investigation may endanger my safety and the safety of my family. I have been told clearly that certain subjects are not meant to be explored by civilian reporters. I have been shown evidence that others who followed similar paths have faced serious negative consequences. I am therefore ending my investigation. However, I want to say plainly that I believe the essential claims made by David Nighthorse are true. I believe our government created and deployed operatives trained to use psychological warfare methods far beyond anything publicly admitted. I believe these programs may still exist in some form, and I believe the men who served deserve recognition for their sacrifices, even if that recognition can never be public." Torres died in 2009 in what was labeled a hiking accident in the mountains near Taos, New Mexico. His research materials were never found. David Nighthorse has not been heard from since 2005. The clearest evidence that the program continued surfaced in 2019, when a Defense Department budget document was accidentally released without redactions before being quickly withdrawn. Hidden among hundreds of budget lines was a single entry: Heritage Warrior Continuation Fiscal Year 2020 $12.3 million. The entry gave no further detail about what the program involved or where it operated. Requests for clarification from congressional oversight committees were answered with claims that the line referred to Native American cultural preservation programs at military bases. No additional information has been offered, but indications remain that the Shadow Warrior legacy extends beyond any official continuation. Across the past 2 decades, steady reports have emerged from conflict zones around the world describing encounters, with forces using tactics strikingly similar to those of the Apache operatives. In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters reported being attacked by what they called the silent death that moved across the mountains and killed without sound or sign. In Syria, both fighters from the group known as ISIS and government troops encountered what they described as phantom units that appeared and vanished at will, using a blend of high technology and psychological warfare techniques rooted in ancient practices. Intelligence analysts who have examined these accounts, speaking only under conditions of anonymity, suggest that the methods first created by the Apache Shadow Warrior program have since been adopted and modified by multiple military and intelligence agencies worldwide. The essential insight of that program, one analyst explained, was that the most powerful form of warfare works on the mind before it works on the body. If you can break an enemy's will, if you can make them fear the dark, fear silence, and fear their own shadows, you have already won. What the Apaches understood and what the military learned from them is that this kind of warfare is not only about technique, it is about tapping into primal human fears that lie beneath conscious thought. Once you understand how to turn those fears into weapons, you create something that cannot ever be fully defended against. The reservations where the original operatives were recruited have become places filled with deep shared trauma. Elders speak softly about the men who left and the ones who returned changed. There are stories passed from one generation to the next, but never officially documented about veterans who came back unable to sleep indoors, who spoke in languages no one recognized, who seemed to exist partly in this world and partly in another. Some communities held ceremonies to try to purify these men from what had been done to them, but the results were uncertain at best. A medicine man from the San Carlos Reservation speaking anonymously in 2012 described the difficulty. The old ways can heal many things. They can restore balance when balance has been disturbed. But what was done to these men went far beyond disturbance. It was a deep alteration of their very being. The military took our warriors and changed them into something that does not fully belong to the human world nor fully to the spirit world. They created beings who stand in between. Some of those men are still out there living in isolated places, unable to return to ordinary life. We sometimes leave food for them in the old places. It is gone by morning, but we never see who takes it. The families of the men who vanished into the program carry their own burdens. They live with the knowledge that their loved ones served their country in ways that will never be acknowledged, using methods that cannot be spoken of, and paying costs that cannot be measured. Some families still hope for answers. Others no longer hope and instead try to remember who their fathers, brothers, and sons were before they were taken. Inside the National Archives, in restricted areas that require the highest clearances, there are said to be entire cabinets devoted to the Shadow Warrior program and all of its versions. These cabinets contain mission reports, training materials, medical files, and psychological evaluations that reveal one of the most extreme military experiments in American history. They also contain letters, personal items, and photographs of the men who took part, men who in many cases have no other record of existence. Men who became ghosts by design and stayed ghosts because it was necessary. The question that troubles researchers who try to uncover this history is not whether the program worked. All available evidence shows it was extremely effective. The real question is what was created in the process and whether it can ever be undone. The men who endured that training were changed at levels that may never fully return to normal. They were taught to access parts of human consciousness that most people never encounter. They were given tools, both technological and psychological, that gave them abilities appearing close to supernatural, and then they were sent into situations where using those abilities was not just allowed but encouraged. Some of those men are still alive. They live on the edges of society in remote areas under assumed names. They are men in their 80s and 90s now, but according to those who have seen them, they remain powerful and deeply unsettling. They move in unusual ways. They notice things others cannot sense. They live in a constant state of readiness that never seems to turn off. For most soldiers, their war ended in 1945 or 1973 or whenever their service finished. For the Shadow Warriors, the war never ended. It simply shifted to new locations. The opposing forces changed, but the nature of what they had become stayed the same. And there is evidence, troubling and consistent, that new recruits are still being trained. That somewhere in the desert Southwest or possibly in several locations, young Apache men are still being approached with promises of serving their country in special ways. That the techniques and knowledge built over decades of classified missions are being refined and passed on. The program that officially does not exist continues to not exist, but its effects move forward through time, creating warriors who will never be honored, battles that will never be recorded, and victories that will never be celebrated. If you have followed this story to the end, you now hold knowledge that has been hidden from the public for 8 decades. You know about a program that turned men into weapons of psychological warfare. You know about missions that broke every rule of civilized conflict. You know about the costs paid by individuals, families, and entire communities so that wars could be won with methods that could never be admitted. This knowledge carries responsibility. The responsibility to remember what was done, to honor those who sacrificed even when their sacrifice cannot be named publicly, and to ask hard questions about what we are willing to allow in the name of national security. But beneath the history and the horror and the hidden truths, there is a deeper message. The Shadow Warrior program succeeded because it embraced darkness, because it used methods that stripped humanity from enemies and from the men who carried them out. It created victories through fear and through psychological destruction. It was effective, but it was not righteous. As you think about this story, I encourage you to turn toward the light instead of the darkness, to seek truth in the teachings of Jesus Christ, who showed us that real strength comes not from creating fear but from expressing love. That real victory does not come from breaking others but from lifting them up. In a world that still embraces shadows, choose to follow the one who said, "I am the light of the world." The men in this story were asked to become darkness. You have the choice to become something better. The files remain sealed. The programs continue. The ghosts still walk. But whether they walk toward the light or remain in shadow is a question still unanswered, waiting in the classified dark of government vaults and in the silent memories of warriors who can never fully come home. If you found this story compelling, remember to subscribe so you do not miss future stories like this one.